Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here at Hillsdale College. It's been about a decade since I was here. I'm very grateful to Larry Arnn for inviting me. I just had a wonderful experience at the dinner table, being able to talk to some of the excellent Hillsdale students. It's an honor to be here, but it's also, I have to admit, it's going to be quite a challenge for me. I'm here because I'm basically promoting a book that's just been published. Rebecca mentioned it. It's called Rebound, Getting America Back to Great. I think there may be a possibility of some of the books being sold at the end. It came out about 2 weeks ago, and I've been promoting it, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here. But I'm talking about American greatness, what made America great, how we get America back to great. But it's a challenge for me because it's not only the students here, but the faculty of Hillsdale that have some of the best scholars in the world that chronicle American greatness and American exceptionalism. I hope I have something to add, but frankly, before this audience, I'm aware of my limitations, and I know that I'm just following in the footsteps of many of the professors and scholars that have worked in Hillsdale and elsewhere. Because when you come right down to it, even though this book is part history, part policy, I'm a foreign policy expert. As you mentioned, Rebecca, for 22 years I led the foreign policy department at Heritage, and I was indeed an assistant secretary of state. So that's mainly where my expertise is. But before that, I was an historian. I have 2 advanced degrees in history from Georgetown, and one of those is in intellectual history. And I did my master's thesis was on Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud. So I have an interest in ideas, especially in how they are promulgated in culture, particularly popular culture. And so it was my interest in history that sparked sparked me to write this book, and sparked the question of me asking again, what made America a great nation? What were its ingredients? What were the key ideas and the values that made America different from other countries? Well, on some level, this is well-trodden ground. There's a veritable cottage industry of books and academic studies on the subject of American exceptionalism. But I wanted to take another look at the question from a different angle, not only from the perspective of intellectual history, the history of ideas, but also consciously to deduce from the analysis some concrete guideposts for a way forward. My thought was that if I could distill the ingredients of what made America a successful nation, to boil them down to their essentials, to essentially discover the historical DNA of America, that could possibly give me some guideposts on the way out of the current crises that we find ourselves in. I also wanted to find, frankly, a counter-narrative to the dominant one that exists today, that no matter how big or how small a problem is, it must be solved by government. And that's because, as that narrative goes, it's always been that way. It's been that way since the New Deal. It's been that way since the 1960s. You know, it's been going on for almost a century, so get over it. You know, that's the way it is. I believe that narrative is not only not true, but also misses the point of how we got to the point in our history where we became the greatest nation on earth, and that we've been living off essentially a false pretense of what made us great. And that we're losing that DNA, losing that understanding is going to possibly lead us into a terminable route of decline. And this is what worried me, and this is why I decided to write the book. So let me begin. Let me ask the question, what made America great? What made it successful? It's been explained many times, but the answer is complex, and for the interest of a talk here, I don't want to go off on too many details, but I would boil it down and sum it up this way. It was a fierce sense of personal responsibility and also moral restraint, enabling not only our system of limited government and our love of freedom, but also our free market system to flourish. These 3 things, the American ethos, the limited government, and economic freedom, interacted in a unique and successful way not seen anywhere in human history. For much of this history, our civic culture was based on the belief that individual responsibility and also moral restraint were necessary preconditions for our freedom. They provided a social order that made political freedom possible. They also tamed the wild horses of the free economy, which gave the entrepreneurial spirit a social purpose, and turning what otherwise could have been a selfish individualism into a cause for the greater good. Larry Arnn often explains this. I've talked to him about it many times. These values and these systems rested on certain ideas, and they will be familiar to many of you here at Hillsdale who study politics and the Constitution. These ideas was, number one, the idea of natural rights. Number two, the premise that freedom is fundamentally a political idea as to how those rights, experienced through the individual, should be protected by the government. And number three, the assumption that the greatest potential source of tyranny was not some other class, not some company, not some group of people in civil society, but the power of government. Those were the ideas, the premises, and the assumptions of American greatness. The question is, and I discuss in the book, is how do we get off track? How do we lose our way from these values and this vision? Well, the answer normally starts, of course, with the progressive movement, and I think that's correct. Much of the attack on the tradition of constitutionally limited government comes from that movement, and the story of how that happened is well documented, and it's well understood, and it's well explained. But frankly, there's more to it than that. There were changes in our culture which have sources of inspiration besides American progressivism. And there were detours and there were external factors which make it difficult to draw straight lines in intellectual history from that era to the current one. So let me explain what I mean by that. What I do in the book is identify three key developments that happened largely in the late 50s and the 1960s, which fundamentally changed our civic culture and our social culture roughly at the same time. In other words, our value systems about how we see ourselves as moral human beings changed at the same time that our expectations of government changed. It was the interaction over a period of 50 years between the civic and the social culture that has given us the dominant culture that we live with today. So there's three of them. Now, the first of these changes that happened at that time were well known. It's the rise and the expansion of the entitlement and the welfare states by the Great Society programs. This set us on the path of government dependency that is so prevalent today. It's crucial not so much because, in the way I'm looking at this, not so much because it created dependency among lower income people in terms of what we call the welfare state. I think more important to the changes in the culture was how it changed the political and social expectations of the middle class. With the onset of Social Security, Medicare, the Farm Bill, in other words, the expansion of programs into the middle class, we moved into the social democratic model from Europe, where there was an expectation that there was a universal participation of all classes in the state benefit system in some way or another. Okay, that's fairly well known. The second is development is a little less well known. At least it's less talked about. It may be well known, but it's not talked about as much in this context. And that was the rise of the counterculture of the 60s. The counterculture overturned the traditional culture of personal and individual responsibility. Instead, it replaced it with a new focus on freedom that was seen as personal liberation from the constraints of morality and religion. The baby boomers, I'm one of them, became the me generation. The 70s became the me decade. There was a famous book written by Christopher Lasch in the 1970s. You may remember this. It's called The Age of Narcissism. Interestingly enough, Lasch was a man of the left, and he was making this as a cultural critique of consumer capitalism, but it could just as easily apply to the counterculture that existed at the time. It was the time where I'm okay, you're perfect enough, you don't have to change, I won't judge you, don't judge me. That was pretty much the popular cultural norm. Many of the old rugged virtues that existed prior to this time went out the door. Instead of sucking it up and working hard to take care of ourselves and our family as our first order of business, it became about our precious self-expression, avoiding conformity, and an almost narcissistic focus on our inner life and our psychological needs. In other words, the counterculture changed the moral culture. How one defined one's happiness and also what our ultimate obligations were. Its motto was, and probably still is, love yourself first. And then from that, all other love and everything else will come. But start with yourself first. Now, over time, obviously, my generation, the baby boomers, attenuated the excesses of the 60s. Even Steve Jobs, who spent some time, on a apple farm in, I think it was in Oregon, and went to India for 6 months. He finally cut his hair and started bathing. But he revolutionized the entire IT industry. And so these are the dominant figures in our culture, business and otherwise. They became, you may remember David Brooks's book, Bobos in Paradise. They called it the Bohemian Bourgeoisie. They got rid of the excesses of the 60s, but they kept the core values of that era, especially its focus on personal fulfillment instead of personal obligation. And they also marched through the institutions, and they became the dominant force in America's ruling elites. They certainly are the dominant force in American universities, this one accepted. Now, the third development, so I got the first one, the Great Society. The second was the counterculture. The third that developed in this time frame was the political intellectual movement. It was the New Left's transformation of American liberalism. It was the transformation of progressivism. Instead, it moved beyond what happened in the 60s with the rise of the New Left. It moved beyond the previous focus that progressives had had on expanding government programs, mainly to protect poor people, to protect children in the factories. It used to have a highly social and economic side to it. But what happened with the New Left in the 50s, 60s, it began to focus more on cultural issues. Themes of personal, mainly sexual liberation, took over from economic liberation. It was making a cultural critique of capitalism as something that supposedly oppresses one's personhood and inner freedom. Anybody who studied the New Left knows where all these ideas came from. They came from Antonio Gramsci, who talked about cultural hegemony. He was an Italian communist. And there were Marxists, Norman Brown, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, who brought Freud into the cultural critique of capitalism. So it changed dramatically from the old 19th century proletariat model to something different. And all of these movements of the New Left gave rise to many of the movements in a modern American liberalism. We all recognize them today. It's gender and sexual politics, multiculturalism, diversity, identity politics. All of these movements came out of the confluence of the counterculture and the New Left from the 60s. So the change here at this time was to update the old socialist war on capitalism and individual freedom. But the war on capitalism and individual freedom remains. That's still the core principle. It's just updated in a different way. It turned away from the 19th century preoccupations and focused instead on a cultural revolution. So what this did, and the reason why I'm spending time on it, is this changed both the moral and the civic culture of the United States. It not only gave liberation a new narrative, freeing oneself from political and capitalist oppression could conveniently be expressed by any number of things, overturning sexual restraints and the like. So suddenly one's personal happiness of what one did in one's personal life suddenly took on a greater political meaning, or at least you could excuse it, to the point where all you were really doing was perhaps expressing your inner need to be free from the constraints of society. Sounded plausible. Now, I'd like to add a word of caution here. For most of the early civil rights movement, it was the traditional American idea of freedom that was at play. It was not this New Left one focused on group rights and identity politics. Throughout most of the 50s and the early 60s, the central idea had been to give blacks the rights they deserved as individuals, but had been denied by slavery, desegregation, and racism. That's the way it had been seen by Frederick Douglass, but also even by Martin Luther King Jr. It was understood as fulfilling the original promise and dream of the Declaration of Independence, and therefore the American founding, notwithstanding the three fixed clause of the Constitution and the compromises that had been made to put the Union together. I'm making this point because it was the original ideas of the American founding that inspired King and the other civil rights movement. It was not the New Left. It was not Antonio Gramsci. It was not Herbert Marcuse. And this is, even to the extent that you can say the progressives of the 19th century were critical of the American founding and constitutionalism, they never went as far as these New Left cultural critics did, who was actually going beyond the notion of constitutional government and going into the very notion of personal morality. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is because the focus of rights of today of minorities as group rights, as group identity rights, and not as individual rights, comes from the influence today does come from the New Left. So it's a distinction from the original civil rights movement. And it had a profound effect, in my opinion. It creates, and I think it causes a huge confusion in this country over what civil rights really is. We talk sometimes about the confusion about difference between natural rights and political rights. There's also a confusion between the individual rights as understood by the founders and the group rights as understood by the New Left. It accounts for the schizophrenic inability of some Americans to draw a distinction between the right of an individual as an individual, no matter what their race is, no matter what their gender is, that they have an innate human value, regardless of what gender or group they're from, that gives them the value not only in the sense of being recognized by God or by nature or even by society, as opposed to their individuality being defined as a member of a certain group, perhaps persecuted in history or by society, but that gives them a sort of a special sense of needing protection from the government. That difference there comes from this influence that happened during these decades. Now, all three of these things, in my opinion, created a toxic combination. The key is that all these developments, the counterculture, the New Left, and also the expansion of the government happened roughly at the same time. They undermine the traditional American ethos of personal responsibility, but the overall effect, and the reason why I'm talking about it in the context of politics, is that we lost the moral, the intellectual, and the political brakes that Americans had once placed on the expansion of government. It was now not only okay to be dependent upon government because you got a benefit from it and it was part of the social contract. I paid into Social Security, I deserved to get something out of it, that kind of pragmatic explanation. But with these other factors put into it, it was also seen as a positive and perhaps even morally necessary thing to do and to expect from your government. My father was from the Depression generation. And he told me the story that when his my grandmother died in 1960, he discovered that she had a debt of $800 from when she had a grocery store during the Depression, when she was carrying the debt, or some of her neighbors were not able to pay for their grocery bills, so she carried the debt for them because they just couldn't afford it. But she couldn't afford it either. So my father discovered it. He went out, and he was just a young father. I was only about 8 years old. And he took a loan, and he paid off his mother's debt. And he went out, and he tracked down the retailer grocer, and he gave him the money, saying, "Here, my mother's debt is now paid." Why would he do that? I mean, today, there are probably some Americans who would do that, but there are a lot who would say, "It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my debt." But he had a sense that he had to honor his mother, and there was a sense of shame of having that debt. That is what has not only been lost about the sense of debt, but also the sense that we have no qualms about expecting to get something from the government that we didn't necessarily put anything in ourselves. That ethos has gone, largely, in a large part of the country. And now it's kind of like, it's my due, it's what I expect. When I'm saying we and you, I'm not necessarily talking about people in this audience. I'm talking about the country at large, and not even all of those think this. But that certainly has been a change. The results have not been pretty. Charles Murray, for example, documents the corrosive impact of the cultural change of these values on lower income people in his book, Coming Apart. If you've not read it, I urge you to go out and get it. Have anybody ever heard of this book, Coming Apart, Charles Murray? Yeah, you go out and get it, because he's a sociologist and economist, and he goes back and he compares communities from today to where they were in the 60s, and almost to every single one of them, the crime's up, the drugs use is up, the marriage is down, there's a lot of social dysfunction, and he attributes a lot of this to the decline of the virtues of marriage, industriousness, integrity, honesty, which existed, by the way, in the same income level of the same class of people back in the 60s. So it's not about class. It's not that these are just poor people, and therefore, which is a kind of an odd thing for a liberal to say, is that, well, they're poor people, you don't expect them to have any values, right? He wasn't being that kind of condescending. He says they did have them, but they don't have them now, and they don't have the social and political capital they once had to climb up the ladder, social ladder, and go and climb up the social ladder of mobility that they have or used to have. That has fundamentally changed. So what had happened, in my estimation, because of these changes, is that the social space that once was occupied by civil society is now filled by government. The welfare programs are crowding out the social networks that existed for decades in our civil society. And what this has done is transform the relationship between state and society. I call it reversing the polarity of state and society. What I mean is this. At times in the history of the earth, you know, the magnetic fields of the two poles were the same direction. And other times they went in the opposite direction. In other words, they reversed their polarity. For much of American history, the poles of government and civil society worked together, pulling in the same direction. Today they are reversed, and they are working against each other, and they are pulling in different directions. In lower income neighborhoods, for example, because the welfare state has replaced most of the institutions of civil society, the bonds of trust of a welfare recipient is largely vertical. In other words, it's upward to the government. And not as they once were, largely horizontal across society, where they had to depend on their family, on the church, they had to depend on their neighbors, they had to depend on other people to help get them through crisis. They didn't even have the opportunity or the luxury to think that somebody in Washington was going to solve these problems for them, so they devised ways in civil societies to create mutual assurance associations, voluntary associations. It was absolutely richly and diverse and quite successful, not only in keeping the families and the social units together, but also in making the neighborhoods safe and making them successful. So, at the same time that this relationship has changed between upward to government, in other words, the bonds of trust are now upward to government, at the same time, mistrust, which used to exist largely between an individual and government, in other words, individuals didn't trust government very much, that has been reversed. That's why I call it polarity, reverse polarity. And now it exists, this mistrust largely exists horizontally across society itself. New groups and classes of people compete with one another for government benefits. This not only heightens their sense of group identity, but puts them at political odds with one another, sometimes entrenching social conflict, but certainly making each of these groups political competitors, trying to vie for some kind of favor from the government. There was another change that occurred as a result of this. The very idea and practice of virtue changed. Historically, for most of American history, it had been considered a private matter, but a private matter with largely public consequences. In other words, it had been mainly about how one measured up individually as a good or a bad person, and that was considered to be a prerequisite of freedom, to sort of enjoy the luxury of freedom. Now, what we call, sometimes it's called political correctness. I don't particularly like that term. But now the idea of virtue has been transformed into largely where you stand ideologically. Where you stand ideologically. That defines you as a person where you are politically. Largely that's how Americans think of it. By this I mean that our civic mindedness is not defined by personally what we do for society through either charity or volunteerism, but where we stand on a political issue. But when I say ideology, it usually means what government is expected to do for the social issue that we care about, not what we are personally expected to do. The trend is, therefore, to create a state-endorsed ideology backed up by, in some cases, even legally enforceable norms, but more importantly, by socially enforceable norms. The old finger-wagging pastor of the 19th century has been replaced by the sneering liberal who thinks that opposition to Obamacare must be caused by de facto racism or even a mental deficiency. In other words, we don't want to talk about the essence of the matter. We just want to go to your motives and where you stand ideologically. And once I know that, I know where you are as a person. That, ladies and gentlemen, is new, at least new in the sense that the last 50 years it's not new, but it was not around as heavily as it is today prior to the 1960s. I put the matter this way in the book. I'm just going to quote it. Here's a quote. "The fairly wide radius of trust that once eased the mutualism of American civil society, in other words, its ability to cooperate, is now much, much smaller. That radius of trust is smaller. People distrust one another more, not only because they live in different neighborhoods and they have different cultures, but because they have different ideas about what civic virtue is. And that civic virtue, as I said, is largely these days defined by where you stand ideologically. But ultimately, and this is the main point I'm trying to make, is that in this ideological equation, it's still all about what government should or should not do. And that's, in my opinion, the trap. It's I'm a conservative, so it's the government shouldn't do something. He's a liberal, the government should do something. And that's where the debate is. And we can't somehow get out of that trap by asking sort of other questions about whether or not a program works or whether it's appropriate. Is this what you expect the government to do? Maybe we should be doing something in civil society differently. These questions don't get asked because we're so preoccupied by these ideological debates. Now, let me switch gears here a little bit. There is a, all this is discussed in the book one way or the other, but one of the results of this change, this transformation I'm talking about, is that it has changed the narrative of what made America a great country. And there are many people in the, not only the progressive tradition, but in the remnants of the New Left tradition, these traditions I just talked about, who believe that the views that I hold are, quote, reactionary, we're hostile to change, therefore we're enemies of the future, and they believe that all I'm really trying to do is turn back the clock. I'm quoting here some of the tweets that my book's gotten. Make war on the modern world. I want to turn America back to the 19th century, to which I tweeted, I seem to think that socialism was invented in the 19th century too, but you know, who's going to quibble? So here's what I obviously don't accept that, and let me explain why. What we call traditional, what I call traditional American values, I spent some time talking about them here, belief in personal responsibility, individual initiative, limited government, all these ideas. They are the most modern of values you can imagine. They not only help make America a modern nation, they revolutionized the entire globe. They made the entire world modern. When Edison invented the electric light, and when Wright brothers flew the first airplane, America was still a country of traditional values, as I described them here. And the same was true even in the 50s, when America was undoubtedly still, or was at that time, the biggest and most successful country in the history of mankind. But at the same time this was happening, all the traits of modernism, its desire for expanding the frontiers of freedom, its love of experimentation. I mean, after all, how do you think these bicycle makers created the airplane? They were great experimenters. And that kind of thing was encouraged by this culture of traditional values at the time because it was all about individual initiative. open-mindedness, love of freedom. Yes, there still existed racism. Yes, there still existed segregation. And I have a section in the book where I meet that head on. I don't want to get off on that right now. But that was part of fulfilling the original promise of the American dream that took time but eventually was fulfilled. Now, problem is that the New Left that I talked about completely transformed or changed the definition of what modernism is. To them, it was all about Darwin, Marx, and Freud. Those are the three gods of modernism, mostly from the European New Left. It wasn't Locke, Jefferson, and Madison. It was Darwin, Marx, and Freud. Now, here's the problem. I believe, and I'd be curious if anybody here agrees with me, I believe it was liberal capitalism and its creation of wealth and its providing freedom for the individual that created the modern world. It was not socialism. God knows it wasn't communism. And I don't even think it was the European model of social democracy. The second point is that the ideas, the values of the counterculture that I have discussed here, represent more of a rejection of the Enlightenment than its fulfillment. They can be traced back to the thinking of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his ideas of sentiment and the collective, both of which were deliberate rejections of the ideas of Locke and the English and Scottish Enlightenments. So over time, these ideas made their way, mainly through German idealism, not only into Marxism and the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century, but also, this is important, into the romantic conceptions of nonconformity and expressionism that define the counterculture of the 60s. Now, in hindsight, what seems to really terrify Rousseau, Marx, and others was the sort of wild openness of the rising capitalist and industrial world. They seemed more comfortable with the old ideals of communalism, which existed in the pre-capitalist and the pre-industrial world. Their worldviews and their values actually were actually throwbacks to the corporatist closed world of medieval times, when the individual's worth was defined by his membership in the community. The Germans have a word for this. Anybody know German? Gemeinschaft, as opposed to Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft was the communal, pre-industrial community where everybody lived in their own orders, and the Gesellschaft was the society of businessmen and tradesmen selling the individual. This was a horror to these people. They were romanticizing the past and saw bourgeois revolution or the industrialization or capitalism as tearing this world down. So from this perspective, living in America here in 2013, and also, frankly, around the world, it was capitalism and the bourgeois revolution, not the cultural proletariat one that made the modern age. It wasn't Marx. Now, I've taken some pains to go through this because I'm not trying to make some intellectual debating point. I'm making the point because it goes to the heart of the claim that conservatives are anti-modern, that I'm anti-modern, that I only want to resurrect a dead past and I have nothing to say about the future. Now, if what I say is true about this intellectual history that I'm laying out, it's not the conservatives, but the countercultural liberals that are actually the one that have the trouble with the modern world, which is why they are constantly trying to go to the government to try to control it, and at the expense of individual freedom, because that individual freedom is an offense to the communal values that existed prior to the rise of the bourgeois revolution. There's a theory that's developed here by the historian Jacques Barzun that applies here, and I'll end on this point here. He talks about the great divide in American liberalism. He claims that liberalism of the old bourgeois classic liberal variety was once a philosophy dedicated to providing more freedom for ever greater number of people. But, he says, no more. Instead, it has become its opposite. Today, it's mainly about denying people freedom, supposedly in the interests of society. You see it every time someone tries to stifle speech in the name of tolerance, or forces you onto a health care plan you don't want in the name of choice. The words and the ideas have become the opposite of their meaning, which is why a lot of times today people don't call it liberalism at all, they call it illiberalism. Now, this is a lot to digest, and I spent some time. What I did was, for this audience, I picked one part of the book, this cultural history, and I dived into it deeper. I've not done this yet before because this is a very intelligent audience, and I feel I would not bore you too much if I did this. But the reason why I'm focusing on this is because I think that we have to understand that some of the problems that we're facing today and the difficulties of solving them are cultural, and they require a cultural answer, which is not political necessarily. It's not, politicians are not going to solve this. It's going to be a way for younger generations or future generations of America to figure out how to interpret in their own way, for their own purposes, what works in American history, what that historical DNA is, and apply it to the problems of tomorrow in a way that works for this society and for this culture and for this country. If you can't figure that out, then you can march through the institutions like my baby boomer friends did in the 60s. So 50 years from now, maybe you can control the country like they do now. But they did it they did it through some organization, but it was mainly for them an intellectual and a cultural challenge. They were interested in the arts, they were interested in experimentation, they were experienced in literature, they were interested in culture for its own sake. And that is what made it authentic, and it's what made it successful. And they did their homework. And so if this is ever going to be turned around, it's not going to be turned around by political manifestos. It's going to be turned around by probably realizing that the course that we're on right now is not working very well, and there's something inherently wrong with it, and therefore let's try something new. And then when we try something new, we try to learn a little bit about our history, and you figure out, well, that worked really well. Why did that work? Well, it worked because of this went together, and it just kind of worked well. And it's not just about the past. It's about the confluence of characteristics that work, and it worked for a certain kind of people. Because even though we've changed a lot, we still are Americans, and we still come from our past, and we still have in our DNA and our memory who we were and where we came from. And that's not entirely lost. There's still millions of Americans who believe in it, not only subliminally, but even overtly. And so that's why I decided to write the book, and that's why I'm here talking to you tonight. So, thank you.